So after what feels like an eternity, we have finally received Decode Talker Heatsoul in the TCG, but that does bring up a very interesting question. Did we get Heatsoul too late? Is Code Talker control still a viable meta strategy in the TCG? So what I have right here is what I think is a pretty competent list for control Code Talkers as it was played in the OCG. Now obviously I'm only using cards that are going to be legal in the TCG, so we won't be using MathMech Circular here. Now if you're unfamiliar with this deck, the basic premise is that we are going to summon Decode Talker Heatsoul as early as possible and use its drawing effect in order to control the game state. From there, we then use our Cyberse cards in order to end out the game, as opposed to combo very heavily as we would in normal Code Talkers. The advantage here being that we can play far more traps and hand traps in our build, so we don't lose to things that we would in regular combo Code Talker. But this deck is very self-explanatory and easy to play, so let's go ahead and just get into some gameplay so you can see exactly how the deck functions. Our first game here is up against Dark Magician, and it demonstrates exactly how this deck wants to run. We opened Cyberse Gadget and 4 different forms of interaction. Ideally, we're going to be able to make Decode Talker Heatsoul here with 1 card, and then stay ahead of our opponent in advantage and control the game state from turn 1. Every single turn that Decode Talker Heatsoul remains on the field, we'll gain another card in advantage, and off of our Heatsoul we did draw Scapegoat. Scapegoat is probably the strongest card in our deck. It represents 4 materials for a Link Summon, with the only downside that we have to wait to use them until turn 3 since we have to set it, use it on the opponent's turn, and then Link Summon on our turn. But that's not a huge downside for our build in particular, since we're looking to extend the game anyway by controlling it rather than comboing like other Cyberse builds generally do. But here you can clearly see the power of control Code Talkers. By turn 3, we've already drawn 3 cards off of Decode Talker Heatsoul, we are able to control the game state with our traps, and we have just devastated our opponent with a massive amount of control as a result. And most of our Cyberse monsters in our deck also represent a 1-card access code. As a result, by turn 3, if our opponent has taken control of the game state, access code does represent an easy way for us to get back into the game. Our next game is up against Exosister, and it represents a particular problem that Control Code Talker has. Because you're playing a lot of 1-card Heatsouls, you do brick in a very strange way that's very reminiscent of how you would brick in something like Cyberse Eldritch. This deck is at its core a trap card control list, and as a result, you are capable of bricking if you draw too many starters or if you don't draw any starters. If you've ever played Guru, Stun, or Altergeist, you know the feeling. However, it hits a little bit different in this deck because there's a very similar Cyberse deck in the format that plays in a very similar way, that being Attic Nister. It plays similarly enough that you might get an impression that they are very similar decks, but when it comes down to it, they have very different win conditions. As a result, bricking early on in a deck like this hits very differently than it does in Attic Nister. In this deck, a singular starter represents a Heatsoul or an access code, while in Attic Nister, a late game singular starter could represent an entire board for you, if your full setup. That's not the case in this deck. You need to know when to fold early on. You don't want to keep your games going for too long and risk running into time, especially in an event. The synopsis here being that it's just much harder here to recover when you've bricked or lost control of the game, as opposed to a deck like Attic Nister or even Combo Code Talker. And because it plays differently and has a different win condition than other Cyberse decks, you do have to just go into your games with a different mindset than you would with those decks. Now there are a lot of benefits to playing Control Code Talker over a traditional combo build. Ironically, your biggest benefit is going second. Control decks do want to go first, but if you're playing a combo variant and you're going against a deck like Flunder, or you're getting Scythelock DPE'd, that can be really, really devastating, while in this deck you still have all of your back row to fall back on. And certain cards like let's say Torrential Tribute against Flunder, or Ice Dragon's Prison against DPE Scythelock are extremely effective. As a result, in the current format, I would actually recommend this build over a combo variant. Combo variants are just going to have a very difficult time going second, especially with the popularity of Scythelock and Flunder in particular. Now, I chose to show this matchup against Labyrinth in particular because I think that Labyrinth and Eldritch, for that matter, seem to have a little bit more longevity in terms of your gameplay than this deck does. This deck seems to want to win about around turn 3 or maybe 5, while Eldritch and Labyrinth seem to have an overall more long-term game plan and keep up their resources a little bit better. This deck does run into a bit of a wall once you start using up all of your traps, and especially when you start running low on life points or stop being able to bring back and reuse your Heatsoul. For that reason, I could almost see this deck being run the exact same way that Cyberse Eldritch is being run, where you just use your one-card starter Cyberse monsters in order to make your Heatsoul, and then use the Eldritch Engine traps, Magician Souls, cards like that, in order to continue your advantage long term and play very, very similarly to that. That being said, I don't necessarily know if going for Heatsoul is better than going for DPE. But if Verte Anaconda or DPE does get hit on the next ban list, you could very easily play Cyberse Eldritch the exact same way that they're playing now, just swapping out your game plan of going for DPE for going for Heatsoul. I think that might be the superior way to run Control Code Talker, if you could even call it that at that point. That's all theory, of course, and I may very well make a video going over a build like that, but in terms of this build, I'm not entirely certain if this is going to be something that's going to be popping up in the meta. It might be the best way to run Code Talkers right now, but I don't know if it's going to be a strong enough control build to compete with what's currently going on in the meta. Now, in terms of playing this deck on a local level, or in terms of introducing people to the game, I think this deck is great for that. The use of trap cards means that you can kind of switch stuff out depending on what your locals might be playing in order to ensure that you can get those wins. And it's very simple to play. You're going for very similar things with monsters every game, so it's very, very easy to learn for newer players. Now, if you're really looking at the meta and you're looking at what's going to benefit the most from Decode Talker Heatsoul, I think the answer is going to be Attic-Nister. Attic-Nister gains a very strong backup plan that integrates extremely well into what the deck is already playing, and as a result, I think that deck gets more of a boost from Heatsoul than this deck really does in terms of meta play. But to be honest, Decode Talker Heatsoul is a strong enough card that I think every Cyberse deck, even like Salamangreat, is going to be playing Heatsoul. I think the only exception is really going to be Marincess, but I've always been at the stance that Marincess is more of a water deck than it is a Cyberse deck. Thanks for watching the video. Tell me in the comments section down below what you'd like to see next, and be sure to like, comment, and subscribe.